Good morning. My name is Jim Hall, and I'm the Dean of University Studies at Rochester Institute of Technology, and we're so pleased that you're taking time on a sunny morning to be with us, that you're not all caught up in eclipse fever, worried about what it's going to do to wildlife in the city and the suburbs. It's going to be a good day tomorrow, I'm sure. This visit of Victor Luckerson is a terrific partnership project between RIT, the Division of University Studies, the College of Art and Design, the College of Liberal Arts. We're happy to partner with the Rochester Public Library Division of Local History and Genealogy, with the Institute for the Humanities at Monroe Community College, the Center for Teen Empowerment just gave a remarkable tour of the Clarissa Street exhibit upstairs. So pleased to see young people here and participating and telling the Rochester story. Many thanks to Rich Newman's public history class at RIT, the photojournalism program at CAD, which has been a great partner. So this has really been an exemplary couple days of good things that we can do here in Rochester. Victor Luckerson is our guest today. He's an independent journalist and author. I have known Vic for about 15 years, we think. We can't quite figure out the start date on all things. But I was previously faculty at the University of Alabama, and Victor was the editor of the campus newspaper. And I knew when I first met him and watched this young man who at the time was only the second black editor that the paper had, navigate so skillfully a complex set of inherited racial issues at that institution. I knew I was in the presence of somebody that was going to become a kind of major force in our culture as we continue to think about truth and reconciliation issues in this country. Victor has bylines with the New York Times and the New Yorker. He was a former business and technology editor at Time magazine. He was an important figure at the beginning of The Ringer, an important website launched about 7 or 8 years ago. But what he's been up to the last 5 or 6 years has been living and immersing himself in the Greenwood neighborhood of Tulsa, Oklahoma, at a moment where the country, where the Greenwood-Tulsa massacre has increasingly become part of American popular culture. And it really is a remarkable coincidence in some sense that Victor's been doing this documentary work at the same time the country's begun to rethink things. It was a remarkable moment yesterday in at XXI and conversation with Vic, playing of quote from Tom Hanks. Tom Hanks expressing outrage that he's 65 years old and has never heard about the Tulsa massacre before. And so we are lucky to have Victor Luckerson here ready to tell us a little bit about that story. As we've discovered the last couple of days, it's a story that is important in and of itself, but it's also a story that tells us a lot about our own history here. We've been thinking a lot the last few days about what is similar and what's different, what is repetitious, egregiously so, and what it is that we all have to learn from each other. So I hope you'll join me in welcoming Victor Luckerson.
Good morning, y'all. I'm from Alabama, so I say y'all. Thank you so much to the Rochester Public Library for hosting me here, Monroe Community College and RIT for partnering on bringing me here to Rochester, and certainly to the Center for Team Empowerment and the Clarissa Street Elders. Honestly, if y'all haven't been to the exhibit yet, it's in another part of the library on the second floor, and it's just a really impressive accounting of not only the policies that undermine Clarissa Street, but the people who were there and thrived in that space. You know, this book I've written really tries to highlight not only destruction but creation in Greenwood. I think that's something that's often left out of black stories, the element of creation and humanity. And so the exhibit here actually does a great job of capturing that. And so I really encourage everybody to go check it out. I think it opens at noon, so right when we're wrapping up. It would be great to check out. So I'm going to begin with reading just a short excerpt from my book. This is actually the very first paragraph of the first chapter. These are the words I wrote after about 2 years or so of research immersed in Tulsa, both being in the community but also being in the archives. You know, I kind of actually wrote the book linearly from like page 1, chapter 1. This is my very first book, so that was pretty intense to have to, you know, leap into that. But this is actually the opening of the book. And we'll start with the first slide too. They called it the Eden of the West. When boosters crafted tales of the land known as the Creek Nation, Indian Territory, and eventually Oklahoma, they wrote of fertile soil that could grow any crop, yielding shoulder-high acres of wheat and melons ready to burst in their succulent ripeness. They described a righteous realm where any newcomer would have equal chances with the white man, while those who remained in the old world, the deep south, were slaves, allowed to be killed at any time. Most important to James Henry and Carly Goodwin, they spoke of good schools for colored children, places where the seeds of prosperity could be sown in the one terrain that could not be burned, stolen, or erased by an interloper, the terrain of the mind. These are the opening words to my book on the history of Greenwood, Built from the Fire, and I've been reflecting on them a lot as I've traveled the country discussing this book over the last 9 months. Today, I'd like us to take a journey through the terrain of the mind, the place where the movements, both righteous and rageful, often begin, the place where school boards and libraries are currently battling over the future of American education, the place where the memory of Greenwood is flickering in and out of the national consciousness over the last 103 years. So part of what I want to do today is a little bit of imagining. I'm going to ask you to imagine with me a few times. So if you don't mind being a little interactive with me, it might make our sunny day inside the library a little more exciting. So the first place I want you to imagine right now is the neighborhood where you grew up, wherever that might have been. I hope it was a warm and inviting place where everyone on your block knew your name and maybe knew to tell your mother if you were acting up. Maybe you could walk to church in your neighborhood or to school. And if you're from a generation far enough back at least, I'm guessing there were probably a lot of small businesses in your neighborhood that were thriving right around you. No matter what kind of place it probably wasn't too different from Greenwood Avenue in Tulsa, Oklahoma. In the early 1900s, Oklahoma was a place where black people thought they could have a fresh start. As Jim Crow policies seized the Deep South with an ever-tightening grip, Oklahoma was seen as a promised land for black people. It was a place where 3/4 of black farmers owned their acreage, and more than 80% of black people could read. Between 1900 and 1920, Oklahoma's black population tripled as people trekked there however they could, on crowded trains or weary-covered wagons. A few even traveled on foot. Greenwood became Oklahoma's brightest star of all. Imagine living in a place where most of the teachers had graduate degrees at the high school. That was true in Greenwood. Imagine living in a place where black people owned their land rather than renting it. That was true in Greenwood. Imagine living in a place where wealth was not the defining metric of success, but community involvement was. That was true in Greenwood. If we were in the old Greenwood right now, I'd be talking to you not at the Rochester Public Library, but at Mount Zion Baptist Church, which is built in a neighborhood with 70,000 bricks and a countless number of prayers. After this talk, we'd head to dinner at Susie Bell's Cafe at 106 North Greenwood Avenue, where her smothered chicken was a neighborhood delicacy. Once the meal was done, we'd catch a vaudeville show at the Dreamland Theater, where lines snaked around the block every evening. And just maybe, after that, we'd go into a dim bar like the Zulu Lounge, where ragtime music dominated the piano, and a substance called chalk beer looked like grapefruit juice, but tasted like a Good Friday night. We'd meet women like Lula Williams, the famous amusement queen, who owned the Dreamland Theater, and a leopard print coat to go along with it. So I have to tell you a little bit more about Lula, because she's actually one of my favorite folks to research in this book. So Lula Williams was an entrepreneur in Greenwood. She moved there in circa 1905, 1906, right around when the neighborhood began. She opened a confectionery where she sold sugars and candies to a lot of the neighborhood children. And in 1914, Lula and her husband bought a property to build a movie theater, which became the Dreamland. And so in my research, I found all of these articles in both the black and white press about the opening of the Dreamland. And in all of these pieces, Lula Williams was getting no credit for what she did. Her husband got all the credit. So you read in these articles that say, John Williams, Negro Rockefeller, John Williams, best entrepreneur in Greenwood. Lula's not even in the articles, mentioned one time. And so as part of my research, I went through so many property records for all different kinds of businesses in Greenwood. And with the Dreamland property records, I found this affidavit that Lula signed in 1918, this sort of sworn testimony that said, I, Lula Williams, own the Dreamland Theater. I own the popcorn machine. I own the stage. I own the seats. I own all of it. John Williams owns nothing. And so that was a really important document to find because it made me kind of like recontextualize who Lula was and how independent she was. And so when you read the book, you actually find that Lula was not only battling the racism across town in White Tulsa, but also misogyny in her own community. And so Lula was actually one of the most impressive and courageous figures in Greenwood, and it was really an honor to be able to capture her story. In addition to Lula, we also meet folks like A.C. Jackson, the genius doctor who the Mayer brothers called the most able Negro surgeon in America. Mabel Little, a beautician who was so good with hair, she even convinced a few men she could save their receding hairlines. And J.H. Goodwin, who helped build Tulsa's first black hospital. What a community contributes to you, Goodwin once wrote, can be measured only in terms of what you give back to that community. By 1921, Greenwood was filled with doctors, attorneys, writers, hoteliers, and shop owners. Here, the terrain of the mine was as verdant as a spring meadow, as Greenwood championed black entrepreneurship, black strength, and black independence. Mary Jones Parrish, a local typing teacher, was one of the first people to call it the Negro's Wall Street. But more than riches, what drew Parrish to Greenwood was, quote, the wonderful cooperation I observed among our people. But this terrain that Greenwood had cultivated, it was contested. The neighborhood success stirred something dark in the minds of many white Oklahomans. Oklahoma, at its founding, had declared that black ambition and intellect were at odds with the white agenda. As a rule, Negroes are failures as doctors, lawyers, and in other professions. William Murray, a future governor of Oklahoma, said at the state's constitutional convention. And in this photo that you can see right here, William Murray is the man standing at the podium on the far left. And it's hard to make out in this picture, but in the very far, in the middle of this upper deck level, in the far left corner of the upper balcony, there's a very, very small partition that's for the segregated section for black people. So there's one small segregated spot where black folks could sit as they watched this man declaring that Negroes were failures as doctors, lawyers, etc. Not long after Murray's speech, the state chose to segregate schools, train cars, and phone booths. In Tulsa, even interracial baseball games were banned. Hateful rhetoric and dehumanizing laws inevitably lead to violence. It was true then, and it's true now. During the 1910s, lynchings became a regular occurrence across the Deep South and its warped appendage, Oklahoma. Race riots spread across the country during a period so bloody it became known as the Red Summer. The violence seemed to be creeping closer to Greenwood with each passing year. In the nearby town of Wagoner, when a black woman was lynched and hanged on Main Street, a local white press declared that the lynching gave the community, quote, a peaceful and helpful appearance. Now, I want you to imagine we're back on Greenwood Avenue. It's May 31st, 1921. The streets are once again thronged with people, but the energy is different. Fear, anxiety, anger. A black shoeshine boy named Dick Rowland has been falsely accused of attempting to rape a white woman. A salacious headline in the white press reads, "Nab Negro for attacking girl in elevator." Everyone in Greenwood and in White Tulsa has seen the story, while the accused boy sits in the county jailhouse. Word is, a group of white men and women, even children, are headed to the jail to rip him from his cell and lynch him. On the streets of Greenwood, men are gathering weapons and planning a march to the courthouse, where they will protect the boy and face down any white man who tries to stop them, no matter the cost. Now, if you were there, would you stay or would you go? Ultimately, a group of about 75 black men marched to the jailhouse. Many of these men were World War I veterans who had served their country abroad and returned home with new notions of black equality. When they reached the jail, the black veterans demanded the release of Rowland, but the police refused. Soon, a black soldier and a white man scuffled over a gun. A gunshot went off, and all hell broke loose. During the night, black and white men shot at each other through the streets of downtown Tulsa. The violence was brutal. One black man was dragged behind a car with a rope around his neck. Another was shot as he ran out of a downtown alley, then surrounded by a group of white people brandishing knives. Members of the white mob broke into a hardware store and seized the National Guard armory. Many of them were deputized by the Tulsa Police Department. A white man named Laurel Buck recalled going into the police station and being told, quote, "Get a gun and get busy and try to get a nigger." The black men who escaped the initial shootout retreated back to Greenwood to defend their home. But the mob had something worse planned. At dawn the following morning, as many as 5,000 white Oklahomans invaded the Greenwood district, brandishing guns, kerosene, and matches. Fires were set systematically. Each blaze conjured in the twilight carried its own awful story. As part of my research, I spent a lot of time reading a lot of these accounts, firsthand accounts from Greenwood massacre survivors. And one that really stuck with me was by a man named George Monroe. He was a 5-year-old boy in 1921 at the time of the massacre. And decades later, Monroe still remembered being under his family's bed in their home in Greenwood and actually seeing the feet of the white men coming into their home, going to the curtains, lighting them on fire. George Monroe would have screamed, but his sister covered his mouth to stop him from screaming. That's the only reason they weren't discovered and probably killed in their home. And so, George Monroe recounted this story decades later. It still haunted him. But the only reason we even know what happened in Greenwood is because of, these accounts that Monroe and so many others courageously told decades later. So I just want to acknowledge the fact that the only reason I'm able to be here now telling these stories is because of the folks who survived all of this and were able to pass that history down back to us. Over the next several hours, white Tulsa laid siege to Greenwood, destroying more than 1,200 homes, razing hundreds of businesses, and killing as many as 300 people. The most harrowing statistic, there were 6 stillborn babies lost during the chaos of the invasion. The Tulsa Race Massacre, as the event was known, was one of the worst acts of racial terror in the history of the United States. Now, if you're sitting with me in this room today, chances are that you've heard at least some broad strokes of this story before. In recent years, the Tulsa Race Massacre has been featured in a lot of television shows and documentaries. It's been acknowledged by a sitting U.S. president. Both President Trump and President Biden visited Tulsa within the last 5 years. And the fact that this event is no longer completely buried history is certainly progress in a country that often wants to run from its past. But I'm here to argue that Greenwood's story is much bigger than those 36 hours of destruction. Black life cannot be defined by the white mob. And so I hope by that time we're finished talking today, when you think of Greenwood, you won't think of angry white men wielding torches and shotguns. You think of the people who called this place home and rebuilt their lives after a cataclysm. For me, my mind always floats back to a meeting that took place about 2 weeks after the massacre. Greenwood looked like a war zone. This photo was taken on June 2nd, 1921, so 2 days afterwards. All the buildings had been reduced to rubble, and all the trees stripped of their foliage. One of the few structures left standing was actually First Baptist Church, one of the only black churches in Greenwood at the time. And at this place, the neighborhood leaders held an emergency meeting 2 weeks after the destruction. J.W. Hughes, the principal of the elementary school, summed up Greenwood's mentality when he got up to speak that day. Hughes said, "I'm going to hold what I have until I get what I lost." And that became the mantra of Greenwood. Despite the odds, Greenwood rebuilt. There were so many individual stories of resilience in those days and weeks after the massacre. A barber took a chair out to the burned-out district as the rubble still smoldered and offered to cut hair. The Dreamland Theater became a makeshift amphitheater, showing films in the open air on muggy summer nights. Attorney B.C. Franklin fended off schemes to seize Greenwood land in a tent he set up amidst the destruction, armed with a lone wooden desk, a few salvaged law books, and a single typewriter. Within weeks of the massacre, the neighborhood was a sea of white canvas tents, as you can see here. By Christmas, the tents had been replaced by hundreds of reconstructed buildings. By 1925, Greenwood was once again humming with hotels, storefronts, and the proud Dreamland Theater. W.E.B. Du Bois visited the neighborhood around that era, and he said, quote, "Scars are there, but the neighborhood is impudent and noisy. It believes in itself." Greenwood enjoyed a second heyday that stretched from the 1930s to the 1950s. And in many ways, when I was up there at the Clarissa Street exhibit, I saw so many parallels between the rebuilt Greenwood and the road of Clarissa Street here in that sort of 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s era. More than 400 businesses filled the district in that era. musicians from Count Basie to B.B. King performed at black-owned venues like the Big Ten Ballroom and the Flamingo Lounge. Steak and frog legs were local delicacies. Women in pleated skirts and men in Bermuda shorts strutted down the stroll, as they called Greenwood Avenue at that time. Residents proudly referred to their neighborhood as Little Harlem, and yes, the Negro's Wall Street. Greenwood's story was Black America's story. Let me give you an example. So my book in particular follows this one family, the Goodwin family. They've had a business on Greenwood Avenue for more than 100 years now. And there's one man in their family, Ed Goodwin. He was a senior in high school at the time of the race massacre, about to graduate, when the whole neighborhood gets destroyed. Ed goes off to Fisk University for college. He comes back and becomes an entrepreneur. So he's opening up things like a shoe shine parlor. He became an attorney later. His family bought a newspaper. But Ed was also involved in some illegal businesses in Greenwood, one of which was known as the Numbers. Anybody here ever heard of the Numbers game? Anybody? Okay, some of y'all. Y'all played the Numbers? You gonna admit it today? You shook your head very quickly, ma'am, and you were like, no, I did not play the Numbers. So for those who don't know, the Numbers was this game that's kind of similar to the modern lottery. In the Greenwood version, there would be, the range was between 1 and 72. If you were playing, you'd pick 3 numbers in that range. If your number is hit, you get a payout. So basically like the lottery, but it was very much illegal in the 1930s. And so I found out through my research that Ed Goodwin, who was in this sort of upstanding family, not only played the numbers, but ran the numbers, actually. This game is also known as the policy wheel sometimes, and so Ed was actually the policy king of Greenwood. And so I would always talk to my mom a lot about my research as I was discovering things and all this kind of stuff. And so one day, I called my mom and I said, Mom, I'm really surprised because this guy, Ed Goodwin, who I thought was this really upstanding citizen, he was like involved in running the numbers and gambling. I also found he was involved in bootlegging. Mom, don't you think this is pretty crazy, this guy was doing all this stuff? And then my mom told me, well, your granddaddy did the same thing in Alabama, just so you know. And so that was a really good lesson for me because it also kind of illustrated that, especially for black folks in that era, there was no like direct route to the middle class, you know? There was no ladder, there was no red carpet. You're gonna kind of get up there however you get there. And so I'd encourage everybody to maybe dig into your own family history. You might find an interesting surprise like I did. So anyway, back to the regularly scheduled programming. Despite Greenwood's ability to come roaring back from destruction, it could not escape the gears of so-called progress as the century wore on. In the 1960s, a slippery new term called urban renewal wormed its way into government lexicon. The idea was to revitalize urban communities and provide better living conditions for residents. But in reality, neighborhoods like Greenwood were labeled as blighted, and the people living there were forced to move miles away to make room for wider and wealthier residents. Ed Goodwin's family, who I just mentioned, was forced to leave their home on Greenwood Avenue, while their family newspaper office was destroyed to make room for an interstate. By 1975, only a half block remained of what had once been one of the most prominent business districts black business districts in all of the United States. The terrain of the mind and the physical terrain are deeply intertwined. Without preserving physical spaces to honor the past, it's easy for that past to slip out of living memory. That almost happened in Greenwood. For decades, the white press ignored every anniversary of the massacre. In the 1970s, writers who tried to uncover the truth about the event were given death threats. Many survivors didn't tell their descendants about what had happened to them. Having been robbed of generational wealth, they did not want to pass on trauma as an inheritance. Now, I want you to imagine one more time. We're on Greenwood Avenue once more. It's May 31st, 2018. That was my very first day in Greenwood. And so to explain a little bit about how I even arrived at telling this story and making the move to Tulsa and doing all these things, I was living in Atlanta several years ago working as a business reporter, and one of my high school friends came to have lunch with me near my apartment. And the film 12 Years a Slave came up, just kind of in our conversation naturally. It wasn't too long after that movie came out. And my friend was telling me that he actually didn't want to see 12 Years a Slave. He had not seen the movie. He didn't want to see the movie. He was really tired of only seeing black folks being brutalized in all these historical depictions, you know. If you think about a lot of the movies that are made about black history, or even sort of what you learn about black history in school books, a lot of it revolves around black folks being whipped as slaves before the Civil War, sick by dogs during the Civil Rights Movement. We don't get that many other kind of depictions in the popular understanding of our history. And so I asked my friend at that time, have you ever heard of Black Wall Street? That's an example of us being successful. My friend had never heard about Black Wall Street at all. He was also himself a young black entrepreneur. So I was like, if you were trying to aspire to be a successful black entrepreneur, you don't have any knowledge of this history of legacy of amazing black business success, there's something wrong here, not adding up, you know? And so based on that interest of wanting to have my friend know more, I pitched an article to The Ringer where I used to work to do a story about Black Wall Street, and I decided to go visit on May 31st, 2018. And this is actually a photo of me on my very first reporting trip in Greenwood. I have all black hair in this photo. That's no longer totally accurate, which is tough to look at, but it was kind of a harrowing trip though in some ways. You know, this photo is showing maybe about 30 people who participated in a vigil and a march, commemorating the massacre, acknowledging the horror of what had happened 97 years before that. But on this very same day, this very same evening, there's actually a baseball game happening in Greenwood. There's a minor league baseball stadium in the neighborhood right now. And so there are actually hundreds of people streaming the opposite direction from us, toward this baseball game, instead of acknowledging the horror of what had happened in Greenwood. And so for me, when I sort of thought about the fact that my friend, who was an aspiring black entrepreneur, had no knowledge of this black success, it had been hidden from him, and these folks in Tulsa, who were literally walking on this side of this horrific murder with no knowledge or acknowledgement at least of what had happened, that made me realize that it was really important to go kind of beyond just writing one story. You know, people need to know more about both the successes of Greenwood, but also the horror it had undergone in 1921. And so sort of based on both these experiences, I decided to go beyond just writing one story. And so the story I wrote initially came out in 2018. I put together a book proposal, sold it to Random House in 2019, and then right around that time I quit my job, packed up my life in Atlanta. I made a black country music playlist, and I moved west to Tulsa. That was the year Old Town Road came out, so it was the perfect time to be moving to Tulsa. And I'm leaving Tulsa this year when Beyonce drops, so it's just a perfect full circle situation. And so, you know, I've been living in Greenwood for almost 5 years now, actually. And living there, I've really come to understand it's truly a place of contradictions. On one hand, it's part hallowed ground, but it's also part tourist destination. It's part black business district, but it's also a gentrified playground. When you walk the streets of Greenwood, you'll find all these plaques on the sidewalks that actually denote what was destroyed. So Susie Bell Cafe, destroyed in 1921, never reopened, for example. But these plaques are abutting the baseball stadium, luxury apartments, hotels, corporate hotels. So all these structures that have nothing to do with Greenwood's history, and so all we're kind of getting is this plaque acknowledging what happened. Despite all of this, the people of Greenwood continue to defend and honor the land they have left. Earlier I mentioned Ed Goodwin, the policy king and newspaper owner. His newspaper, the Oklahoma Eagle, is actually still in Greenwood right now. The family still owns it, in fact. And they have an office on Greenwood Avenue today, more than 100 years after they first came to the community. Ed's son, Jim, is 83 years old and still publishes the paper every single week. And he has a granddaughter named Regina, who's a legislator in the Oklahoma State Legislature, where she represents the Greenwood District as the only black woman in the House of Representatives. Also today, there are 2 known living survivors of the Tulsa Race Massacre, Leslie Bennyfield Randall and Viola Fletcher, who are both 109 years old. They're still spry and strong, and they respond really well when you say, "Hey, Miss Fletcher," or "Hey, Miss Randall." I got to interview both of them at different times for my research a few years ago, and I remember the first time I met them, I really had this sense that I might break them by getting too close, you know. But when I got to talk to them, they were very much with it and sort of like, you know, don't treat me with kid gloves. I'm a grown woman, you know. That's kind of their energy. And in fact, they're so mobile still that they are often in the courtroom quite often. These 2 survivors have filed a reparations lawsuit against the city of Tulsa and other government entities that's been kind of winding through the courts for the last several years now. And in fact, this past week, the Oklahoma Supreme Court heard their case, and these women were actually in the courtroom in their wheelchairs at 109 years old, seeking justice. And it's a really tough case in a lot of ways. There was a 3rd living survivor, Hughes Van Ellis, 102 years old. He was at all the court hearings as well with them for several years, but he passed away in October, so he wasn't at this last hearing that happened last week. In a lot of ways, this case is tough because when the case was initially filed in 2020, it was the Miss Randall, Miss Fletcher, Mr. Ellis, and also all the descendants of the case All the descendants were dismissed from the case about a year ago. And so now there's only Miss Randall and Miss Fletcher, which means that when they pass away, this pursuit of justice goes right along with them. In Tulsa, in Oklahoma, and in America, the arbiters of so-called justice are patiently eyeing the hourglass. But their understanding of time, it's backwards. An untreated wound does not heal as the years go by. It festers. An unpaid debt is not wiped from the books. It accrues interest. Greenwood's ancestors, the ones who witnessed its creation and its cataclysm, must all eventually go silent. Yet their souls still stir in the voices of their descendants. And finally, people are listening. The story of Greenwood has been quiet for far too long. But you are now carriers of this story, which is not just black history, but American history. The terrain of the mind is under attack in America today. But if the denizens of Greenwood could defend their land and their people with such courage, the least we can do is defend their legacies. Thank you. So I'd be happy to answer anybody's questions about Greenwood, or if anybody's read the book, has questions about the book, happy to answer anyone's questions. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I haven't had a chance to read the book yet, but can you talk about the Rochester connection to this story with the woman who wrote the first account?
Sure. Mary Jones Parrish, yes. So in my talk, I mentioned Mary Jones Parrish, who was a typing teacher in Greenwood. She actually moved to Greenwood from Rochester. So in her book, Events of the Tulsa Disaster, she briefly mentions the fact that she was living in Rochester, New York. I believe working in education and that kind of field as well here. I don't know the exact details of it, but she came from Rochester to Greenwood circa 1918, 19 or so, and opened a typing school on Greenwood Avenue, actually. And so when the race massacre happens in 1921, she's like in her school, which is also her apartment, on Greenwood Avenue. She has a 7-year-old daughter named Florence when the mob comes. And very critically, Mary Jones Parrish decided not to immediately run away. She wanted to stay there and observe what was happening and document it. And so she has a very, very vivid and detailed first-hand account of what she experienced. And a couple weeks after the race massacre, some other leaders in the community came to her and said, hey, we're going to ask you to maybe, if you wouldn't mind, are you able to interview other folks about what they experienced? And so in this book that she published in 1923, there's probably about 20 first-hand black accounts of what happened. And that's really, really important because at the very same time, the white press in Tulsa was advancing a very different narrative. They were saying there was an even-handed fight between black folks and white folks. They were saying the police tried to help quell the disturbance when, in fact, they were helping to energize the mob. And so Mary Jones Parrish's work is actually really, really vital. She was essentially the first journalist to actually capture what happened here in an honest way. So we all owe her a lot, and she came from Rochester. So thank you for the question. That is true, thank you. So Events of the Tulsa Disaster was recently re-released under a new name. Cannot remember the name of the book right now. But if you look up the book, Events of the Tulsa Disaster, it'll come up. And it's actually her great-granddaughter, Ann Lisa Bruner, is the one who actually spearheaded the re-release of the project. So the book is actually available on Amazon and any other site now.
How
Yes, sir.
large of an area was destroyed?
So it was about 35 square blocks. So Greenwood at the time was a very sort of densely packed neighborhood. So it's like 7 or 8 blocks north to south, 5 or 6 blocks east to west. And so essentially almost everything habitable in the neighborhood was destroyed, except for First Baptist Church, which I mentioned, where they had this meeting later. And then also the high school was not destroyed. It was turned into a hospital ward by the Red Cross. And so there's lots of photos, actually, of the immediate aftermath of the high school, where you see patients in beds and doctors trying to treat them and all this kind of stuff. So besides those 2 structures, almost everything was destroyed. More than 1,200 buildings were destroyed. Yes?
Is this massacre taught in the schools in Tulsa?
Yes and no. So it's kind of true in a lot of places, honestly. So it is part of the state teaching standards in Oklahoma to teach about the race massacre. However, I spoke at Oklahoma State University last semester to a group of, most of them are freshmen actually, and they told me they'd never heard one thing about the race massacre. And these are students who are 18, 19 years old right now. And so I think it's very much case by case, And I would not be surprised if it's getting harder to teach. Oklahoma has a law that says that if students feel uncomfortable learning a subject, teachers can be punished, like a lot of other states have now. And so I think all these kinds of laws are creating this chilling effect among some educators. And so I was actually surprised myself to learn that even current students aren't necessarily getting the education. So it's definitely, I think, kind of touch and go in terms of who's actually learning the history. Oh, yes, sir, right here.
You've excited me to read your book. I picked up some of your writing in the New Yorker.
Okay, thank you.
That's an amazing accomplishment, what you've achieved in your career.
Oh, quick sidebar. I also have a New Yorker cartoon, actually. They made a Talk of the Town piece about me when the book came out, and they made a New Yorker cartoon of me, so that was exciting, too.
All right. That's in your Wikipedia post.
Right, should be, yeah.
So I'm fascinated with the historical backdrop. And Matthew Diamant, you might even know him, half American. He published that a year ago. He's a Dartmouth historian. And the role of the black press, perhaps even in your research. And he denotes most of his book focuses on African American service in World War II, but it starts in World War I. And you actually had touched upon, returning GIs, the sense of mindset that had changed around World War I. So if you could address somewhat the historical backdrop and
Sure.
also the role of the black press in the community, because I believe Tulsa had quite a robust one.
It did, yes. A lot of my book focuses on Ed Goodwin. His gambling is a very small side story in the book. It's mostly about how he owned this black newspaper, actually, and all the achievements they had. So yeah, there's a chapter in my book actually called "The War at Home and Abroad," and it's about World War I in particular. And so the context of the whole scenario is, this war starts in Europe, and black leaders actually sort of encourage black people to enlist in the military in hopes that this show of patriotism will grant them rights here in America. W.B. Du Bois, who would become sort of one of the fiercest critics of the American system in a lot of ways, he actually he encouraged black folks to enroll in the military and fight for their country. And so he was hoping that this would lead to, again, greater rights at home. However, when they get over there to the French theater, in fact, black soldiers are being treated much better by French citizens, but the U.S. military literally sent secret memos to the French military saying, you need to enforce Jim Crow over here too. Don't get new ideas in these guys' heads. They come back home. They're being faced with the same kind of discrimination. Black men are being lynched in uniform. And so Du Bois changes from saying that, we need to support the military, try to sort of figure out a way to unify, to saying that it might be time for black folks to raise, quote, the terrible weapon of self-defense. And so this sort of, I think, both the new ideas they were granted by going to abroad and sort of seeing a different side of citizenship in France from Frenchmen, combined with the vicious reaction when they came back home, actually very quickly pivoted a lot of black intellectuals to say that actually self-defense at all costs is what's valuable. And so when these men in Greenwood went to the courthouse that night, they had these ideas. And the book actually talks too, though, about how they're sort of like the intellectual level of the Du Boises of the world and the press and all these folks sort of saying in these high-minded ways what we need to do. But there's also a first-hand account from a teenager from that time period of the race massacre saying that when he was at the barbershops and he was at the clubs and all this stuff, sneaking in and all that as a kid, he was hearing black guys saying that if somebody tries to lynch somebody in Tulsa, we're going to be in the middle of it, And so there's kind of like the high-level discussion of it, but there's also the ground-level discussion of it. And those things combined, I think, give you a moment when black folks in Greenwood decide nobody's going to lynch this guy in our neighborhood, no matter the cost. So, other questions?
One of the features of Oklahoma was that's where they shoved all the Indians at one point and then took their land away again at another point. And it seems like with regard to Native Americans, the standard approach was always one of lynching and killing at any, freely, as far as at least white people were concerned. I was wondering, was there any component of Native Americans within Tulsa or within Greenwood, or were they kind of marginalized already from what was going on?
So in terms of Tulsa itself, Tulsa is sort of earlier name is Tulsa Town, which is derived from an indigenous name. So like Tulsa, the core of Tulsa was indigenous land originally. In the early 1900s, as you sort of alluded to, the federal government compelled all the Native American tribes, all the 5 civilized tribes who had come from the Deep South on the Trail of Tears, they're all compelled to give up communal land ownership and do individual land allotments. And when this happened, millions and millions and millions of acres of land were essentially swindled from Native Americans into white hands. And so because of that, a lot of Native American folks were pushed out of the actual heart of Tulsa, you know. And in terms of Greenwood itself, there were very few indigenous people in that area. However, a couple of things I'll say. One, there were black folks who were in those tribes. The Native American tribes owned slaves, actually, and so when they came to Oklahoma on the Trail of Tears, they still owned these slaves, and after the Civil War, they were compelled to free the slaves, but also make them tribal citizens. And so in the Greenwood era, certainly, of 1921, there would have been Black Creeks, Black Choctaws, Black Cherokees, etc. And a lot of those folks lived in Greenwood, and they had gotten those land allotments too. Some of them got their land swindled, but some of them had a lot of land wealth. The other thing I'll mention is that Tulsa County includes some of Osage Nation. And so if anybody here is familiar with Killers of the Flower Moon, the book or the film, it's a story about these very vicious murders that were perpetrated against the Osage Nation in the 1920s. And so the nexus of the murders discussed in the book aren't in Tulsa County, but it's pretty close, and there were Osage folks in that area. And so, you know, there's kind of a toxic stew going on, I think, of a lot of greed that is being transformed into violence against both black folks and indigenous folks at that time. Yes.
Thank you so much for this talk. I've learned so much in this time period, and I'm only 30 pages into the book, but I'm already just so grateful for the stunningly written and well-researched book. The footnotes are just so intimidating to me. There's so many of them. It's wonderful.
It was intimidating to put together.
Oh my
I
gosh.
promise you,
Well,
yeah.
thank you.
Yeah.
My question is about the intervening years between the urban renewal policies and this slide you have up here. I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit more about what life was like in Greenwood, what people were doing in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s, if you wouldn't mind.
Sure, I'm happy to. So in that time period, so Greenwood was hollowed out by urban renewal. Those 400 businesses I mentioned, they were pretty much all relocated or closed. And in fact, a lot of the land, one of these kind of like, almost like sadder than the more obvious development things that happen in Greenwood is sometimes when urban renewal happens, they build like a civic center or some new facility or whatever. But in Greenwood's case, a lot of the land was just laid empty for years and years, decades and decades. So if you drive through Greenwood now, there's lots of empty land, actually. And so then that's a haunting in its own way. There's actually this one abandoned set of stairs near Greenwood, like a residential stairwell, but the house is gone. So you see this one empty stone stairwell and no home. So they're called the steps to nowhere. People know them as that. In terms of what actual folks were doing, Greenwood is kind of very close to Tulsa's downtown center, so a lot of folks moved further north, black folks, and there's like this North Tulsa area, which had its own kind of like newer version of having shops and restaurants and all that kind of stuff. But when you combine like people being more scattered because of urban renewal with the rise of big box stores and Amazon and all this kind of stuff, there's actually very, very, very little business development now in North Tulsa. And so it's kind of a situation where for a lot of time there was just a kind of an ongoing decline of that area. But I will say, even in the short time I've been there, there's been a lot of ignited re-excitement about black entrepreneurship. So there are new things going on, but it's a very long journey back to the heyday I described from the 40s and 50s. Yes.
Hi. I guess I was just going to ask you about what it was like to be there. First of all, the prose in this book is just beautiful. Beautiful.
Oh, thank you.
So the writing is, I guess, like, of course you're going to go to the next page. But I was interested in terms of the actual place right now. Mm-hmm. And so you were there for 5 years when you weren't interviewing someone or writing or researching, and you got up in the morning and left your space. What is it like to walk down a street right now?
Sure. Well, I didn't leave much because of the pandemic, so mostly I was just at my house. And honestly, that like really transformed the reporting process. I'd moved there with the intention of really embedding myself and really developing intimate relationships. Like, for example, one idea I'd had when I went there, I said, I'm going to get a coffee with somebody every single week when I'm in Greenwood. And that was impossible for probably a year and a half or more, you know? And so the rhythm actually became much more punctuated by sort of the crises that occurred, you know? If you think, go back, rewind through the pandemic years, everybody sort of gets locked in their homes and whatever, when the Tom Hanks got sick or whatever that day was, you know? And I was sort of in that malaise with a lot of other folks for a couple of months, honestly. It's hard to write and hard to focus. And then, you know, this black man in Minneapolis has been murdered by the police, and everything kind of like spirals from there. And in Greenwood in particular, there was this big protest actually that shut down an interstate highway. This is recounted in the part of the book. And so I found myself sort of thrust into covering all of these kind of ongoing crises that occurred. The George Floyd murder was in May. President Trump visited Tulsa to relaunch his presidential campaign in June. That was a humongous national controversy. There was a Black Lives Matter mural that was written in Greenwood Avenue that was vandalized and then destroyed by the city of Tulsa. That was a huge controversy. And so there's all these different kind of like spike moments that were kind of occurring, even though outside of that, nobody was going anywhere. You know, we were so static. And so it was definitely kind of an unusual rhythm, I would say. But when I did get chances to sort of try to like break bread with folks, there's a really good fried seafood place called White River Fish Market in Tulsa, and a lot of older folks love going there. So I'd have lots and lots of lunches with older folks at White River Fish Market. That was like my go-to spots, like meet with folks and break bread. So.
I absolutely love everything that you're saying. I'm very grateful that you did visit the Clarissa Street Uplift exhibit here in the other side of the library. I'm in great gratitude to my sister Catherine Sprague Dexter, who's the elder leader, one of those leaders. It would have never have happened without exactly what you did, talking to the leaders in the community, the ones that have the historical perspective on how it impacted their lives then and how it impacts their lives now. One of the things that I'd like to share and see if you have any comments about this, it's around where do we go from here in regards to building those bridges? There are a lot of wounds. The same thing people felt in Greenwood, people feel the same here in Rochester when we walk down Clarissa Street in that neighborhood. It is not the same. We don't have a place to show where we grew up to our children. And so tell me, how do you view healing the wounds? What needs to be done by humanity?
Well, first off, I just want to say that I love the model here and the idea of connecting young people who have a history in this community but aren't maybe not even aware of it with the older folks who actually remember that history. It's really, really powerful, and I'd love to see that in particular sort of documented the steps you took, you know, 'cause I think other communities can learn so much from that, you know. Like in Greenwood, there's actually nothing as well organized as what you're all doing here for that purpose, and I think it'd be really, really helpful in other places. Honestly, I feel like so often the folks who have been harmed or all the pressure is put on them to find the solution, and I really think that placing more pressure on city and government officials to help find those solutions is really, really important. In Greenwood's case, there's been a lot of sort of grassroots efforts at commemoration and revitalization and business building, but we also have this lawsuit going on about reparations, you know. And so I think one of the sort of challenges of navigating all of this is that sometimes city and government officials will almost use the commemoration as a pressure release valve or a scapegoat, you know. In Greenwood's case, there's a history center that was built in 2021 using a lot of corporate funding and nonprofit funding and raised $30 million, but none of the money went towards massacre survivors or descendants. And so for me, at least, I think that what I try to do is at least sort of call out or expose those kind of hypocrisies, because often the people who actually have the resources to help sort of solve these challenges and rebuild these bonds or create the infrastructure for it are the ones who aren't even putting up the dollars, open up their wallets, that kind of thing. And so I think trying to find like who are those larger sources that can help. To me, I think the model's already kind of there. I think folks kind of know what they want to achieve, but then finding the financial backing for it is what's really tough. So I think for me, I'm always trying to see like who in the larger structure can help with this and who should be called out for doing so. So, we can get somebody new back here, yeah.
I'm not sure if you covered this. I apologize if you didn't. I missed it. But, you know, here in upstate New York, the upstate cities, we're seeing a interesting dynamic in that apartments are being created in the center city. They're well occupied. They're both affordable housing, market rate housing, and people seem to want to move back into city centers, which is a great thing because you're reusing existing infrastructure. You're not building a new subdivision out in the next cornfield. I think it's a really great thing that this is happening. So my question is, you described Greenwood as being near Center City, right?
Yes.
In Tulsa. So is that happening in Greenwood? And if it is happening, is it considered gentrification, which is often, you know, has a negative connotation? And I guess a related question too is, what is the racial mix in Greenwood now?
So there has been a fair number of new housing developments in Greenwood. I think the issue is that, you know, they're fair market or high market, so there's really expensive apartments because they're like what's really happened is that the historical boundaries of Greenwood are kind of not even acknowledged anymore or honored. And so there's a neighborhood called the Tulsa Arts District. It used to be called the Brady District. Brady was a Ku Klux Klan member, so they changed that at least. But it's called the Tulsa Arts District, and so it's kind of the boundaries of Tulsa Arts District keep moving further and further into Greenwood. And so you have these like Tulsa Arts apartments that are very, very luxury apartments that are very expensive. Technically they're in Greenwood, but they're not even sort of acknowledging they are, which helps them kind of avoid the uncomfortable question about why are you building this in our neighborhood, you know? And so further north in Greenwood, there is some residential housing that's a little bit more, I would say, like middle income, you know? And so I don't know the exact racial makeup of the neighborhood, but you have this, there's the luxury stuff in the right by downtown. Then there's a big college that was put in the middle of the neighborhood during urban renewal. And then there's some middle income housing that's kind of mostly black. And so it's nothing like it used to be in terms of the density of black folks living there. And there hasn't really been an effort to make what is the new housing or the urban housing, I mean urban as in like apartments and that kind of thing, targeted towards lower income folks who might have been there in the past. So there is housing, but it's not really being made with any kind of intentionality, I would say. Yeah.
I'm going to suggest that we just shift into some informal conversation back in the room. But first, I hope you'll join me in thanking Luckerson.
Thank you.
Testing, 1, 2, 3. Good morning, Mr. Victor.
Yes.
I remember when I was in the South, they called me Miss Cheryl.
Okay.
But my name is Cheryl, last name is Hall. And while I was there, I was in Ardmore, Oklahoma. I passed through to Tulsa and Oklahoma City as a tractor trailer driver. I'd been layover. And while I was in Oklahoma, a prosecutor in New York told me, "What are you doing in Ardmore? You should be in Tulsa. That's where all the black professionals go." So I was really excited to know that my GPS is truly Tulsa, and not Ardmore, Oklahoma. I'm going to do a little paradigm shift, though, just momentarily. I'm really happy that you're here, and I'm really happy that you're discussing these issues that were pertinent to what happened between blacks and whites in the West, particularly in the USA. And my concern of how I'm approaching this is from an employment and labor viewpoint in terms of the big heading. And I'm glad for the clarification because I really thought it was about Tulsa, but you're saying it's about Greenwood? That's a different neighborhood?
Greenwood is a neighborhood inside of Tulsa.
Okay, great. So that's more specific. All right, so I'm supposed to head to Greenwood, not Tulsa. Just not Tulsa, but Greenwood.
Oh yeah, you want Greenwood in particular when you head over there, yeah. Yeah.
All right, great. So I said I'm going to do a little paradigm shift here, and you work with me a little bit and see if I'm onto something. But my topic is employment and labor. So I'm always interested in where's the money and how are people moving as a result of that. And it was one of my most successful things as a professional that I negotiated well on behalf of people. having disputes with hospitals, in other areas throughout the USA. So, and then I started doing more research on why we came, right? And there's some in-depth, intuition that slavery happened in the West to accommodate and compensate for what happened in North Africa. So the beef was shifted here to even it. So first, say the whites had enslaved the blacks, and then the even took place, where now the whites evened it and enslaved the blacks. So I'm looking at it from an employment and labor contract dispute.
Right.
Should we get through this and we heal, and everyone who came in blindfolded, including the whites and the blacks, they're trying to work through all these things that happen. The conclusion is, in the end, that it was truly labor and employment. And an even. Africans did it first to the whites, then the whites evened it and did it to the blacks. And because the North is coded to the West, it had to be West Africa that was chosen, which is like Ghana, Nigeria, where majority of the blacks came from. If it is deemed a labor contract, employment and labor, would some of these things be justifiable? As chattel, post-chattel, and would the whites in the end, when it's all over, be exonerated because it was deemed labor and employment, the blacks being the labor force at that time?
Right.
And I don't know if there's too much work being written about that, but I know that in 2018 was the anniversary of Jesus Christ, 2,000 years. So the conclusion is the contract is over.
Right.
That both whites and blacks are here in overtime. Right? So Ghana is inviting all the blacks, including me, born in the Caribbean.
Right.
They're going around inviting everyone to return to Africa because the labor contract is over.
Right. Well, to try to answer your question a little bit, the book itself only focuses the reparations question, or who should be receiving any kind of compensation. The book itself only focuses on Tulsa, in particular, in the case of the Greenwood and the Tulsa Race Massacre, and these folks who had a very particular loss they suffered. However, I think that when you sort of think about the mechanics of reparations and how they might play out in Greenwood, it could be applied to other scenarios such as enslavement. So for me, at least, it was important to sort of walk through, here's one specific scenario with one specific model and the specific debates going on. But I think you can kind of take the dynamics in Greenwood and what people are discussing now about reparations and sort of look at the different avenues, right? Because in Greenwood, there's a court avenue that's going on with this lawsuit. There's a legislative avenue going on with people in the legislature seeking reparations. There's an avenue with the city council going on. And so there's it just shows different examples or models, I think, that could be applied to scenarios such as chattel slavery. Thank you so much for the question. Thank you.
Hello. I wanted to be able to at least mention the fact that we are honored that Victor took the time to come to our exhibit, the Clarissa Street Uprooted exhibit, across the street in the Rundell Library. And what I wanted to say was two things. I have not read your book, but I will read it, and I will read it twice. But I also want to ask if we could at least mention the fact that we want everyone to also take a look at the exhibit we have. And I want you to, Victor, could you just give a few words on what are your comments about your visit this morning?
Sure. I found it very, very edifying, and in some ways, what I said actually when I walked out is that I liked how it captured Black life beyond violence. There's two museums in Greenwood, but both of which have a very heavy emphasis on the race massacre itself. And so I think you get a takeaway about that event in Greenwood, but you don't get as much about Black life afterwards. And so I think be able to capture like that rhythm of Black life through the photos. You see photos of folks in the neighborhood in Clarissa Street. And also you get to see like the redlining maps and the housing seizure records and all this kind of stuff. So it really just, I think it very effectively captured that life in that era, both in terms of how folks lived, but also how the government kind of intruded on that life. And so it was, I thought it was very, my book attempted to capture both of those two things, like the good and the bad, you know, and I thought that the exhibit did a great job of that too for this space. So, yes. So I'm going to be signing and selling books in the back of the room. Thank you all so much for coming out.